Okay, so here's part two about my relationship with my wife. In part one, I told you about how I met her and got into the relationship, and I told you also a little bit about my ex-girlfriend before her, Maya, and how that went, how I ended that. Today, I'd like to discuss with you how it went with Ita. So, first thing you need to understand is the culture in Indonesia is largely based on harmony. And it doesn't matter that terribly much, as far as I could tell, what religion you're in. Um, Most people in Indonesia are more interested in preserving harmony, saving face, and that sort of thing than they are in honesty, despite the fact that the majority of the religions in Indonesia require honesty. For example, in Christianity, honesty is supposed to be very important. In Islam, there are only very specific situations where you're allowed to lie, and that basically is a situation where you lie by misdirection, and that is only for the saving of another person's life. So, say for example, somebody comes to the door of your house, and the person says, "Have you seen?" Or and this doesn't really translate into Indonesian because they don't have the present perfect tense, but so it'd be a more simpler, more like a present simple tense, like "Can you see your husband?" for example. And if the wife knew that this person or people that were at the door had the intent of killing her husband, she could turn away from her husband, not being able to see him, in other words, and literally say to the people or person at the door, "No, I can't see my husband." Which to the listener, if they weren't thinking about it, they would be like, "Oh, okay, the husband's not home. Let's go elsewhere to look for this guy." But in reality, she had both told the truth in the most literal sense, but in the sense that was intended by the people trying to kill the husband, she had lied. That is basically the only acceptable type of lying in Islam that I have discovered. Anyways, so in harmony, you don't want to, except for when it gets really bad, you will not reveal publicly problems with a neighbor or a family member. You won't you won't publicly embarrass another person. You won't do things basically that make somebody else lose face. And you also won't do that for yourself. So if you're late for something, you'll lie about why you're late. If somebody else is doing something naughty, you won't say anything about it publicly until it gets really bad. And it has to be fairly bad before people will actually start talking publicly about it. But yes, in general, things get kind of swept under the rug, or at least are discussed in private. Um, and in my experience in dealing with most Indonesians, that's almost always what happened. People would not be honest with me, and they didn't really appreciate my honesty. Um, you know, I'm 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 a pretty honest person. I'm pretty candid too. And although in some ways Indonesians can be very candid, they talk about things that Americans would be feel uncomfortable about discussing, like sex and periods and stuff like that. Um, yeah, it's a huge difference. And although I would talk to people from cultures that felt that they were much more honest than the Javanese people, and the Javanese people are pretty famous for their lack of honesty and saving face and all that, they're also the dominant culture. But even with these cultures like the Batak of Sumatra, Even they had a hard time with my level of honesty and candor, and it was a challenge, and that was one of the challenges my wife and I faced, was this lack of honesty. And I don't want to give any specific examples because I don't want to speak ill of Ita. Let's just say that there were situations where I caught her, and even with evidence, it took getting to the point where the evidence was overwhelming before she would admit that she had done something wrong. During the early parts of our relationship, Ita seemed to behave in a subservient way. She didn't seem to have confidence in handling matters. So I taught her that we were equals. I taught her that it was okay for her to make decisions, and it was a process. She had to learn that that was okay, and it was a little bit interesting because in the early part of our relationship, if I was busy doing something and she had made food, she would come over and she'd feed me while I was doing it. Even if I was like playing video games, instead of saying, "Glenn, stop playing that damn video game and come eat dinner with me," or lunch or breakfast or whatever it was, she'd just sit next to me and she'd spoon feed me, which was kind of cool, but kind of weird. And one of the philosophies that women have is to make the men feel like they're the king. But behind the scenes, the woman is the queen, and the man is eventually going to figure that out. That really she holds a great deal more power than publicly is visible. Another challenge that she and I dealt with through most of our marriage up until the last few years was language. Yeah, we had a lot of misunderstandings. A lot of times I thought she understood something, and she thought also that she understood it. And only later did we understand that that was not the case. The language barrier was significant, and it affected us many times over the years. Eventually, she got to the level of fluency where, when we wanted to visit America, she went to the embassy for an interview. This was back in 2006. She was good enough at English that the American that interviewed her at the embassy thought she'd already been to America. So to her credit, she did a really good job at improving her English. But there were still problems at that point. It was only years later when she got to the point where English stopped really being a barrier, and our barrier was just communication differences and honesty and things like that. Communication and language were both other challenges, and the honesty. Another challenge is the difference in religion. Before we got married, while we were still dating, we had discussed the difference in religion and at that time that I started dating her, I was in Islam. The reason is before I met her, I'd actually joined Islam, and it wasn't really so much that I was fully committed to Islam, but because at that time I had been dating Maya, and there was an intention of marrying her, and interfaith marriages were, in some areas, were accepted, and in most areas were not allowed. So in order to facilitate our marriage, being that I didn't have my own religion and Maya was Muslim, I converted to Islam. I read the Quran, and I was trying to understand things. I read some other books while I was dating Ita, and I had been honest with Ita about my position, in that I told her, I said, look, I'm not sure if I'm going to stay in Islam or not. I'm studying it. If I feel called to be in it, I will stay in Islam. Otherwise, I will not. And she said that was okay for her, but that we shouldn't tell her family. I wasn't really happy about concealing that information from her family, but I really wanted to marry her, and we were afraid that if her family knew, on top of the fact that I was a foreigner and they had severe reservations, especially her father, about her marrying a foreigner, we were pretty sure that not being a real devoted Muslim would be the nail in the coffin for our relationship. So we didn't reveal that information until I had made a final decision, which happened a couple of years after our marriage, I believe it was. And her parents weren't happy. Her family wasn't happy about it. Those we told, but there's at that point they weren't ready to press the issue. So before we married, though, one of the things that we agreed upon was that we were not going to force our children to choose either of our beliefs. We weren't going to push them in one way or the other. Well, it didn't work out that way. Me being without religion, being I didn't know it at the time, but being a deist, and her being a Muslim, I really didn't have a lot that I could contribute towards faith, and her family did. And so when my children were younger, especially my daughter, primarily, almost exclusively my daughter, I was mostly working at schools that were either multi-faith or Christian. So Jasmine was exposed to Christianity, but as she got into kindergarten, it became a Muslim school, and that between that and the exposure at home to Islam through her grandmother Sutarti, because my father-in-law Istarmo unfortunately died in 2006, months after they had gone to Mecca on their pilgrimage. So yeah, it was a situation in which it was basically destined that Jasmine and Deregi would be indoctrinated into Islam through school, through friends, through home, and that's exactly what happened. And I did not feel comfortable doing more than trying to raise my daughter's awareness, because Deregi was too young to discuss it with. But I said, okay, Jasmine, I want you to do this research about the religions of these countries. So I chose countries from around the world that I knew had different religions, and I discussed with her after she had finished that if she had been born in China, for example, she probably would have been born as an atheist. If she had been born in India, she probably would have been born as a Hindu, or been indoctrinated into Hinduism. If she had been born in America, she probably would have been a Christian, and so on and so forth. And just to help her to see that where you are born usually dictates what religion you will be, as opposed to the holy message of God ultimately shepherding everybody into the correct religion. And I did that with her probably 3 times, and I think the first time that we had a discussion about religion, she said, well, what should I do, Papa? What do you want me to be? And I said, well, I can't make that decision for you, Jasmine. That decision is up to you. I don't have a religion, and at that time I didn't know what a deist was. So it's your choice. I can't force you. I won't force you. And I still wonder whether I made a mistake at that point, but I didn't feel it was fair to do what most parents do in indoctrinating their children into the religion that they believe in. So I would talk to my daughter sometimes and my son about what I believe, but it was not something that I forced on them, directly or indirectly. So the difference in religion was an issue. Another big problem, and the religion issue became a much more substantial problem toward the end of Ita's life. Probably starting in 2015, my mother-in-law started to believe that Ita was going to die, and she gave up on, I believe, saving Ita's life and decided to save Ita's soul. So she started to secretly pressure Ita about me, either converting to Islam or divorcing. Again, I can't pin down when this really started. I initially thought it started in 2016, but I received new information after moving back to the States from my kids that it may have actually started in 2015, which would have been when my wife relapsed the first time. And so my wife's mother, Sutarti, and then her younger brother, Ajat, and his wife, Endang, started to pressure Ita about this because in Islam, if you're a man, you're allowed to marry a non-Muslim. But as a woman, you're not. And so they wanted that situation resolved to save Ita's soul. I'm not smiling because of that. I'm smiling because I misspoke. And then they, in either late 2016 or probably in 2017, they dragged my brother-in-law Aji into it. And there was some information that was given to Ita for whatever reason. Some of it was true, and a lot of it that I've heard and read, most of which I heard from family members and friends of ours who accused me of things that Ita told them, supposedly, and things that Aji wrote on Facebook against me that supposedly came from Ita's mouth. A lot of it was completely false. But some of it was made up by Sutarti, Ajat, Endang, and Aji to try and destroy my ability to stay in Indonesia, especially so they could get Jasmine and Iregi by getting me deported. So they told a lot of lies, like that I had stolen some jewelry and sold it for my own, and put it in my bank account, which I didn't. Ita and Sutarti gave me jewelry prior to a trip to Singapore to get a visa, and that was for the purpose of selling it there to buy the camera that we had, which was a Konica Minolta, which I forever regretted buying because that company went out of business. I should have stuck with what Aji said to get the Canon. Anyways, they also said that I had occasionally abandoned my family, which wasn't true. I'd gone on business trips when I was called out of town by schools and English teachers to have me help them in their communities, and so on and so forth. They told a bunch of really nasty things, and I actually had to block. I blocked a lot of people from Indonesia after my wife died, and it wasn't because I didn't like those people. I missed some of them terribly. It was because I didn't know who was going to try to slam me on Facebook. Because in Indonesia, the laws are stricter than in America about character assassination, but I was getting no support from the police because Ita's father had been in the police, and so Ita's family had ties to the police, and my police report just basically evaporated when I filed a complaint against Aji for the defamation of character and that he was looking for an assassin. But, this all revolved around two things. Primarily, it was religion, but it was also culture, because our culture here in America, and although in some ways it's similar to like the Southern culture, the Deep South, traditional culture of, being nice to somebody's face, but not necessarily behind their back, polite, right? The Javanese pride themselves on being polite. But primarily there are significant differences. They have what's called jam karet, which is rubber time, which means you don't have to be punctual, and you lie if you're not punctual for the and it's just understood that people come when they come, and if they're late, they're late. And that's something I adapted to because there are advantages to that way of thinking as far as punctuality. But they didn't like that I didn't behave like a Javanese person. They didn't like that I wasn't a Muslim, and they pressured Ita a lot. I didn't know for the large part that they were pressuring her. Ita once twice, maybe three times, mentioned to me that she was getting some pressure from her mom about me not being Muslim or being Javanese enough. And Ita's mother-in-law and I think her brother Ajat, sorry, when I say brother Ajat, I mean Ita's uncle Ajat, Sutarti's brother. They sometimes pressured me because I was dealing with problems of neglect, malpractice, and malignant behavior by certain doctors and nurses at the hospitals Ita was being treated at, and I was going and I was dealing with it directly with the PR person, the public relations person, and some of the people that were the source of my ire were, although I was being polite, but I was being direct, and they were upset about that and complaining about that. And it got back to my wife's family, and then they were pressuring me not to do that. And I said, look, I'm trying to save lives of other patients as well as Ita's life, because these people are doing things that are bad, and I'm not going to stop. And they didn't accept that. They were angry with me for daring to be honest and trying to protect the lives of patients, including Ita. I had to be in the hospital with Ita almost constantly. Ita didn't really trust her mother to be there because she wasn't physically and mentally strong enough, and she knew that her mother wouldn't protect her from the bad behavior of certain people and the neglect and stuff, and that she wasn't healthy enough to handle the stress of being there 24/7. And I had to, sometimes I had to change the IV bag because if it was, they weren't prompt about coming around and changing it. And I had to learn to get air bubbles out of the line, and I had to do other things for Ita because I couldn't rely on the nurses especially to give her that care in a timely fashion. There were times when medicine wasn't delivered. There was one time she had to go to chemo and they didn't give all the stuff that they were supposed to give. And so I basically had to protect Ita, and because she was scared. She was very scared of being in the hospital alone. And if I would actually leave the hospital, she'd be like, please don't be gone for longer than a couple of hours. I'm really scared. So my life at that point, from the time she was diagnosed until the time she died, became increasingly a life of being in a hospital. But anyways, getting back to the subject, the biggest barriers to the success of our relationship were culture, religion, and communication, including within that honesty. I personally would not recommend intercultural, interfaith marriages unless you're going to completely convert yourself to the other person's culture and or religion, or you guys are going to be able to find a happy medium that the family is going to be able to accept and not interfere with, which, as you can tell from my story, didn't last. Because initially my wife's family was tolerant, and they just became less and less tolerant over time. And also, the language barrier is a significant problem, even discounting any issues of saving face and differences in levels of honesty and candor. If you can't communicate with each other well, especially because of language, your relationship is going to have a lot of problems, and you may be the partner who's not aware that the person you love is miserable. All those things set aside, you may end up being in a relationship where you're being abused by your partner. And I've heard about that from Indonesian women, where they were neglected or abused by their partners, especially if they were taken back to their home country. But yeah, marriage is a very serious commitment that should never, ever be underestimated. You really both need to go into it with the firm commitment of self-improvement, not to become the person that your partner wants you to be, but to become the best person you can possibly be. If you're not willing to commit yourself like that, you shouldn't get married. If you're going to abuse your partner, you shouldn't get married. Please think very carefully before you marry, because even if you're from the same culture, you speak the same language, and you're from the same religion, if you don't make a serious commitment to self-improvement throughout your life together, you're going to have a lot of problems. And if you can't keep control of your anger, you're going to have a lot of problems. And if one of you thinks honesty is good and the other doesn't, you're going to have a lot of problems. It's a big commitment and a big challenge. Think very, very carefully. I see a lot of people and they're not ready. I have seen a lot of relationships where it was clear over time that the relationship was getting worse and worse. Seek help if it gets worse. Okay? Seek help. Don't be so stubborn, and listen to your partner. If they say there's a problem, take it seriously and deal with it. I had problems with my wife. She had problems with me, and I wish we could have. I wish we could have gotten help for our problems. I just want to go back to and touch on the fact that Ita was saying things to friends and family that weren't true. Now, first of all, I don't know firsthand that she did this, but I believe it, because in the last, I would say the last month or two of her life, Ita started to say things that weren't true. She told me things that when I tried to verify them, the people that they involved denied them. For example, she told me that my mother-in-law was refusing to allow our assistants, we had two maids, to help us with our business and to help us with Ita, Uus and Yani, and they were great. We really loved them, and they were very helpful, and they really made our lives easier. But she said that her mother was not allowing them to eat properly, that she was denying them meat, and so on and so forth. And I was flabbergasted. I was angry that my mother-in-law dare usurp, our authority. It wasn't her house. It was our house, and refuse to allow Uus and Yani to eat properly. So I talked to Uus and Yani, and they flat out denied this statement that had been made by Ita. So I learned that Ita was saying things that were not true. So sometimes when I talked to her, especially toward the end of her life, she would say things that I knew for a fact were not true. That she was maybe hallucinating, or she just wasn't able to form coherent thoughts, or something like that. And it was very painful to watch this decline in her mental ability. It was very distressing. So I suspect that maybe toward the end of her life, in addition to the truths that she may have told friends and family, there were many things that she said that were fabricated because she was delusional, that she was hallucinating, that she couldn't think clearly any longer. The consequence of that was that her family had a much worse opinion of me than they should have, and her friends also. So because of what Aji did, because of what Ajat and Endang did, and what Sutarti did, I cut off ties with almost every Indonesian I knew that had anything to do with Ita's family, to protect myself, and to keep them from posting nasty things on my Facebook page and Twitter and stuff like that. And I was going through a lot. I was really messed up, and I needed to be able to fix myself, and I couldn't deal with the backlash from those people. And since I didn't know who I could trust, who was going to backstab me and go back to Ita's family and tell them what I was saying, I just cut off most people. But unfortunately, there were still people that were reporting to them what I was saying, some of the ones that I didn't block. And then there were people who would just make a fake account and friend me on Facebook so they could see. So in the end, it didn't make a difference. But to those of you who were true friends who I cut off, I apologize. I really didn't want to, but I just didn't know what else to do. I was severely traumatized. I was scared. I didn't know where to turn. So I apologize to those of you who wanted to continue to have a relationship with me. I know it's unfair, and I hope you can forgive me. Anyways, that's what I wanted to share. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.